Hey there, welcome in. My name is Avril, and in this corner of the internet, we chat about writing, life, and whatever else comes to mind. Over the past week, I finished reading Just Friends by Haley Pham, and I wanted to have a quick little chat about it. A couple of things before we get too far into the video. This book chat is not meant for Haley Pham. It is not meant for anybody on her team or associated with her team. Like any book review, this is meant for the reader. Additionally, I wouldn't consider this a full-on review of the book. I will kind of go into my rating of it a little bit later on, but I'm not here to do a full-on deep dive about the book itself. But I did want to have a chat about something that I noticed in the writing style and something to keep in mind as you're working on your own book. And as I always say when it comes to anything like this, I am not here to tell you how to write your book. The things that work for you may not work for me, and the things that work for me may not work for you. So let's get into it. Just Friends is a contemporary second chance romance following Blair as she returns from her college graduation to her hometown, where she is tending to an ill relative and reconnecting with her ex-boyfriend Declan. So I came across Just Friends because of that one review that was going around a little bit and causing a bit of a discourse within the bookish community. And as far as Haley Pham goes, I was not really familiar with her content. I think I did see the reel where she announced the name of this book and that she had gotten a publishing deal, but beyond that, I hadn't really engaged with her content. In that initial review, there were some critiques about the writing style, and it kind of spiraled into this whole discourse about reviews in general. And I will have a few videos about that linked below. One of the things that came up in that book review were some of her word choices. Now, I'll be upfront, I only gave this book 2 stars. There were a few issues I noticed with the pacing and a few plot holes, things that I felt should have been a bigger moment, or things that didn't have enough payoff, or things that felt like the payoff of something that should have been established earlier in the book. But a large part of that came down to just the writing not being for me. One of the things that came up in that review I mentioned earlier was that Pham's word choice felt rather clunky or just didn't fit the tone of the story or genre as a whole. I have come across a couple of reviews that said it felt like she had picked up a word of the day calendar and just threw in as many entries as she could have into this book. I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but there were definitely a few instances where the word choice really threw me through a loop and was kind of distracting to me as a reader. So I wanted to kind of make a video about this because it is something that I have struggled with in my own writing and something to just be aware of. But first, an anecdote. Back when I was in elementary school, I had this one teacher who loved to bring up $100 words anytime she got. So a $100 word essentially means using a stronger synonym in place of a simpler word. For example, saying something was massive over big. And the idea was essentially to place a higher value on these larger words to encourage kids to begin using them in their writing. And for me, that kind of got misconstrued a little bit because I understood that to mean, oh, if I use bigger words, that makes my writing better. So the bigger words I use, the better my writing is, and the more serious I'll be taken as a writer. But that approach comes with its own problems because a lot of the essays I was writing at that time, figure about 4th or 5th grade, were beginning to sound like that one episode of Friends where Joey is writing a recommendation letter on behalf of Chandler and Monica and signs it off Baby Kangaroo because he whips out a thesaurus and replaces every single word in that letter to sound more impressive. And that idea also kind of carried into the fiction I was writing pretty much around high school, where I was looking for the most impressive word I could find to make my writing be taken more seriously. The thing is, clarity is key in writing. You could have the best story ever written, but if your reader can't make sense of it, that won't matter. And I started to realize this was a problem when I was editing a chapter in my project I was working on at the time. And I, for the life of me, could not figure out what this character was saying. And if I, the writer, could not figure out what this guy was trying to say, how could I expect my reader to? In conversations about $100 words versus simplifying your writing, it often raises the question of whether or not that means dumbing it down for your reader. And that is definitely not the case, because clarity is everything in writing. And if you are not able to effectively get your point across to your reader, the level of your writing is not going to matter. So when you come across a word that is either more uncommonly used, or in the case of this novel here, Just Friends, where a word choice feels kind of off, it can throw your reader out of the loop and essentially remind them that they're reading a book. And that was kind of an issue I was having with Just Friends, where you have lines like, "That feeling is personified in my stomach right now. I force myself to perceive its beauty like the travelers who flock here every summer might. I have to yield to a conglomerate of pedestrians. The use of my nickname causes the genesis of our friendship to spring to mind." And to me, that is a prime example of what I mean when I say $100 word. Blair is recounting how she and Roshi met and how she earned the nickname of Blink. Technically speaking, genesis is a synonym for beginning or origin. And on a technical level, sure, it works to say the genesis of our friendship. However, as a reader, it threw me completely out of the loop. It would have been more efficient or smoother to say that it reminded her of how our friendship started, or how we met, or even just the origin of the nickname. And another thing that I kind of picked up on was her use of intoned as a dialogue tag. Now, "said is dead" is a whole other debate for a different time, but that does kind of feel like an example of avoiding the simpler word to sound more impressive. Now, of course, I don't know Haley Pham. I cannot speak one way or the other as to her creative choices here, but it is a good reminder to think about the reader experience as you're writing. Because at the end of the day, yes, you should be writing for yourself first, but if you plan to publish your writing, you do have to kind of think about your future audience and how they will interact with your book. There are times where a bolder word choice can serve the story well. Perfect example being Twilight. Bella does gravitate toward more impressive vocabulary words, but with her, I kind of feel like it works better because it kind of establishes that feeling of her being an old soul and more likely to fall in love with this 100-some-odd-year-old vampire, which is a choice. But with Just Friends, these bigger word choices like conglomerate and perceive its beauty and genesis didn't really fit with the overall tone of the story. They didn't really feel natural for Blair. And there is kind of a throwaway line of her being a nerd and loving writing and loving words, but it kind of felt more like a hand wave. As a reader, it was just kind of distracting. One bit of writing advice that I got in college was that you don't want to be reminding your reader that they are reading a book, that you want your writing to be immersive and create this experience that your readers can just kind of sink into and forget that they are just looking at ink on a page. The point is, you basically want to avoid doing anything that feels like you're intruding on the reader and reminding them, hey, you're reading a book right now. How do you feel? And using bigger words like conglomerate or genesis in a context where it doesn't really fit or align, it did kind of cause me to be thrown out of the story. And like I mentioned earlier, I am guilty of this in my own writing and in my day-to-day vocabulary as well. It's very common for me to say things like, oh, that's not in my jurisdiction, as opposed to that is not my job. But to take this conversation out of writing, for example, if you didn't already know, I work at an escape room. And part of my job is going over the rules and making sure that everybody knows what they're getting into. When I'm doing my intros and rules and everything, I do gravitate toward those $100 words. But I also know that I have to be mindful of the crowd and the audience, because at the end of the day, it is not about putting that flair on the rules, but making sure that the rules are understood. One of the rules where I work is that in order to receive a hint, every player needs to give us the hand signal. If even one player does not have that hand signal up, we cannot give you the hint. And when I'm explaining that in my rule intro, I usually do say that generosity is not without a caveat. But if I see that there is a small child in the room who may not know the word caveat, I will throw in an additional, there is one condition. Because again, I'm not expecting them to know the word caveat. And that isn't me dumbing down the rules for that child. It's my way of making sure that the child can follow along and make sure that they are aware of the rules. And the same goes for writing a book, because you need to make sure that your reader can follow along and make sure that they aren't going to be thrown completely through a loop when you do throw in a weird word like Genesis or conglomerate. But that is where I will end this conversation about Just Friends and $100 words. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and spending a little bit of your day here with me in this corner of the internet. If you have read Just Friends, please let me know what you thought of it down below. Were you getting tripped up by any of these more creative word choices, or were you not really impacted by them? I would love to know. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.